The second sea trial of the Fujian ship made people nervous. It said that foreign satellites captured at least two sharp turns, one of which was a full 180-degree loop. Someone calculated that the turning radius of this loop is an astonishing 3.4 kilometers. In comparison, the turning radius of the American USS Ronald Reagan is only 500 meters, making the Fujian seem quite clumsy. Such details were captured clearly by Western satellites, indicating that in the event of a conflict, Fujian's position would likely be easily tracked. The turning radius is no small matter. A smaller radius means a more agile vessel, while a larger radius makes dodging missiles much harder. The Fujian's large turning loop reveals a significant weakness in this area. This gap isn't something that can be bridged overnight. It involves ship design, displacement, and rudder performance, among other factors. It seems the Fujian has little room for improvement in terms of maneuverability. Emitting black smoke, the ship is easily recognizable as the Fujian, and its sluggish maneuvers make dodging missiles difficult. The second sea trial of the Fujian started on May 23rd and only returned to the Jiangnan shipyard on June 11th, during which it continued testing its power systems and performed sharp turns, zigzag maneuvers, and reverse thrusts. These tests should have been done during the first sea trial, but the Fujian missed them. Looking at the 15 days between these two trials, it's likely there wasn't much reflection. They simply prepared supplies, tidied up the ship, and headed north to the Yellow Sea to complete the tests left unfinished last time. Photos from the scene show that the Fujian's draft line wasn't visible when it left the Jiangnan shipyard. This indicates that it was likely carrying more fuel, water, equipment, or personnel, or perhaps it was transporting materials for repairs at the Dalian shipyard. Moreover, this sea trial took place in the northern Yellow Sea near Dalian, where U.S. and Japanese reconnaissance planes had difficulty reaching, allowing the Fujian to more comfortably. The carrier-based aircraft training base in Xincheng is nearby in Bohai Bay, so proximity helps in familiarizing with the local hydrometeorology and preparing for future carrier-based aircraft takeoffs and landings. The shipyard in Dalian is expected to provide shore-based support for the Fujian in the future. Overall, the short interval between the two sea trials of the Fujian is related to the ship's construction progress and testing plans, but there are undoubtedly higher-level strategic considerations as well. Over the past 2 years, especially this year, the international situation has become increasingly complex and volatile, with security challenges around China. China urgently needs its aircraft carrier to make a statement. Currently, only the Shandong aircraft carrier is battle-ready, with the Liaoning undergoing major repairs and the Fujian just starting sea trials, essentially being rushed into service. The urgency of the situation cannot be overstated. NATO might intervene in Ukraine at any moment. The Israel-Palestine conflict in the Middle East is escalating, and the U.S. is conducting military exercises in the Pacific with allies, planning to simulate sinking a quasi-aircraft carrier in summer. The India-China border remains tense, and Taiwan's new leadership further strains the Taiwan Strait situation. Russian President Putin is reorganizing the defense ministry amid political purges, all pointing to the prelude of major conflicts. Looking at China's coastal areas, the USS missile destroyer recently transited the Taiwan Strait and patrolled the Xisha waters. USS RC-135 reconnaissance planes took off from Japan, entering the South China Sea via the Bashi Channel, and conducting close reconnaissance along the Guangdong and Hainan coasts up to the Xisha Islands. The U.S.-Philippine Defense Cooperation Agreement grants the U.S. access to 9 military bases in the Philippines, used for strategic tests and exercises during the recent Balikatan 2024 joint drills. Taiwan's new leader, Lai Ching-te, took office on May 20th, mentioning that the two sides of the strait are not subordinate to each other, a sentiment echoed by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who sent a representative to the inauguration. Meanwhile, Liaoning aircraft carrier is undergoing a year-long repair and upgrade, replacing air defense systems and radars, indicating how outdated the previous systems were. Having just completed a sea trial in March, it still needs time to reach full combat capability. In this context, the high-level mandate for the Fujian, China's third aircraft carrier, is to complete testing as quickly as possible and achieve combat readiness. However, despite working around the clock, Fujian is not a panacea. It remains a newly assembled Chinese carrier, and expecting it to rival the U.S. is unrealistic. Building a qualified aircraft carrier involves meticulous design, construction, testing, and integration. The U.S., with its extensive experience, took significant time, so Fujian shouldn't be expected to defy these established processes. One particularly frustrating aspect is how some overly patriotic individuals boast that the Fujian ship has achieved 3 world firsts: electromagnetic catapults ahead of the U.S., a phased array radar with extraordinary range, and a groundbreaking new power system. None of these claims are true. First, let's talk about the electromagnetic catapult and arresting system. During testing, the arresting cables broke multiple times, causing casualties. The catapult technology is reportedly based on an undergraduate thesis, which was decided upon by senior military officials. The author even posted this information on WeChat. In just a few years, Chinese experts have applied this research to aircraft carrier construction, but its reliability is questionable. If the catapult fails, it can be deadly. How do senior military officials justify this? By saying, "We gain experience in actual combat," meaning they launch the project first and address problems as they arise, without considering the lives at risk. For the crew, this is incredibly dangerous. Next, the phased array radar. Some claim it can see up to 200 kilometers from Hong Kong, but in reality it can only reach 50 kilometers due to issues with RF chips. When using American chips, it indeed had a 200-kilometer range. After switching to chips made in China, the noise level increased, making it impossible to see anything clearly at 200 kilometers. It can send radar waves that far, but the return signal is too noisy to discern anything. Calling this a 200-kilometer radar is misleading. Lastly, the power system. As we mentioned, the Fujian has a turning radius of 3.4 kilometers because it is a fully electric vehicle, which doesn't generate much turning force. It turns as slowly as a tractor, hence the large turning radius. These 3 myths are busted. None of them hold up. Some media like to compare the Fujian to American aircraft carriers, which is quite naive. The Chinese military strength is not as formidable as some think. Their covert support for Putin shows their limited capacity. If they were truly powerful, they wouldn't hesitate to confront the U.S. Issues like Taiwan's independence and semiconductors are major concerns for China, but they lack the military strength and deterrence to address them effectively. Let's briefly compare the Fujian with U.S. carriers. All American carriers are nuclear-powered, allowing them to operate indefinitely at sea as long as they have enough supplies. The Fujian often gets compared to the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier, whose nuclear reactors are more powerful than those on the Nimitz-class carriers, with stronger electrical output capable of supporting directed energy weapons in the future. The USS Gerald R. Ford has 2 nuclear reactors and 4 propulsion shafts, requiring minimal maintenance. In contrast, the Fujian uses conventional power, burning diesel. Without a network of naval bases like the U.S., refueling is challenging. While it can refuel at ports along its network of military bases in the Indian Sea, maintenance is difficult as these are mainly civilian ports and may not offer safe havens in emergencies. Even supply ships need escorts, adding to the complexity. The U.S. has 10 Nimitz-class carriers, each with a displacement of 87,000 tons. The USS Gerald Ford class reaches 100,000 tons, carrying at least 75 aircraft. The Fujian, with a full displacement of 80,000 tons, can only carry 60 aircraft. The Fujian has just begun sea trials, whereas the USS Gerald Ford was deployed in November 2022. The USS Gerald Ford went to Europe in May and then moved to the eastern Mediterranean in October after Hamas attacked Israel, stabilizing the situation there before returning to its U.S. home port after 244 days. Chinese carriers can't match this long-range deployment capability, mostly operating in the Taiwan Strait. Despite all the hype about China's new carrier, the facts are clear. Since 2012, the Chinese Navy has been operating carriers for over a decade, yet the Liaoning is still practicing strike group integration. Operating a carrier requires experienced operators, engineers, and technicians, knowledge passed down through generations in the U.S. Navy. This knowledge isn't in textbooks and can't be stolen by Chinese spies. While the Fujian is launched and undergoing sea trials, familiarizing with the equipment and operations will take time for the People's Liberation Army, requiring a gradual learning process. Despite being more advanced than its predecessors, the Fujian cannot embark on long, unrestricted voyages like its American counterparts. The People's Liberation Army Navy lacks a global network of military bases and contracted ports like the U.S. Navy does. They have only a small supply fleet accompanying their carrier group, responsible for refueling, ammunition, and supplies. Their overseas base is in Djibouti, which can only support a small escort fleet. Essentially, even with the Fujian, the Chinese Navy has to bring its supplies and can't travel far, unlike American carriers that can go anywhere with extensive support from global bases. Western navies believe that establishing partnerships is the cornerstone of regional naval strategies. The U.S. Navy values multilateral maritime partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region, enhancing these relationships through exchanges, exercises, joint operations, and industry cooperation. Currently, China lacks both this capability and awareness. Even compared to Japanese carriers from 80 years ago during World War II, China's carriers are significantly short. On December 7, 1941, during the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan deployed 6 carriers and 414 aircraft, catching them off guard. At that time, Japanese carriers had formidable combat power. In comparison, combat capability pales in comparison to those of Japanese carriers from 80 years ago. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku, Zoikaku, Soryu, and Hiryu each carried dozens of aircraft with impressive speed and range. Although China's current carriers have larger tonnage, the number and quality of their aircraft are lacking. Despite being 21st century planes, China's carrier-based aircraft management and coordination are far behind. During the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan's Mitsubishi A6M0 Type 99 assault planes and Type 97 carrier attack bombers worked seamlessly together, achieving significant results. In contrast, China's J-15 carrier-based aircraft is heavy and must use electromagnetic catapults for full-load takeoffs, which is still unreliable on the Fujian. On the previous 2 carriers, they couldn't take off fully loaded. Supply issues are also a problem. Japanese carriers in the past had global resupply capabilities similar to the US, never worrying about food and supplies. The Fujian ship needs a lot more practice, learning, and experience to catch up to even the level of Japanese carriers from 80 years ago. This shows that China's pursuit of aircraft carriers is more about projecting an image of power and political significance rather than actual combat capability. Despite boasting about the Chinese Navy's prowess and downplaying European navies as outdated, it's always the Western and Indian navies that step up to protect global maritime trade during threats. The Chinese carrier groups are nowhere to be seen. Besides trying to build carriers like the US, China also aims to target US carriers. Sinking one US carrier wouldn't cripple the US, but China's logic is to force the US to negotiate over Taiwan. By showing they can sacrifice equipment and personnel, China hopes to scare the West into taking military action against them, essentially using terror tactics to threaten the US and the West. China especially wants to lure US carriers into the Yellow and East Seas for easier targeting. The Chinese military has created carrier mock-ups as targets and is training with AI to locate and attack US carriers. Advancing their strategy against the US is a key goal. However, pinpointing US carriers with satellites is difficult as they operate over vast areas, unlike Chinese carriers that stay close to shore. Furthermore, China's Dongfeng missiles may not be as effective as claimed. According to U.S. assessments, Dongfeng 21D and Dongfeng 26 missiles need third-party data for mid-course updates, and how their targeting subsystems handle trajectory adjustments remains uncertain. U.S. Rear Admiral Carlos Sardiello expressed confidence in the U.S. Carrier Strike Group's ability to perform missions effectively and safely, even against Chinese missiles. Therefore, the Fujian ship appears somewhat awkward. It lacks sufficient combat and supply capabilities, can only operate close to home, and yet aspires to compete with the U.S. It's setting an impossible mission. Aside from aircraft carriers, recently China's strategic nuclear submarines have also encountered issues. On the morning of June 18th, fishermen in Penghu spotted a Chinese Type 094 submarine surfacing near the median line of the Taiwan Strait. Later, a warship escorted it back. Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense confirmed the incident, stating they had relevant information. It is said that the submarine likely encountered problems while returning to Qingdao from the South China Sea for annual maintenance, forcing it to surface. The Type 094 strategic nuclear submarine is a prized asset for China, with a displacement of over 10,000 tons and capable of launching JL-2 international ballistic missiles with ranges of over 10,000 kilometers. China often boasts about using it to target the US, however, it couldn't even secure its position near the Taiwan Strait. Without Russian submarines providing cover, it might not even survive on the surface. In contrast, the US is reportedly planning to deploy 5 carrier strike groups to the Western Pacific by the end of the year, specifically to block Chinese and Russian submarines from causing trouble in the Pacific. By then, the Chinese and Russian submarines will likely need help to receive any orders, with their electronic systems heavily disrupted. Thus, if China's submarines intend to accomplish anything, they first need to figure out how to get past the US. China's homegrown strategic nuclear submarines are lacking. They need to learn from the US and practice more instead of just boasting. In a real conflict, there's no room for bluffing.